Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Coy. I'm the president of the New York Financial Writers Association. I'm honored to be moderating this session today on with Hannah Levintova of Mother Jones Magazine on private equity. And we're going to be basing this on two articles that she wrote in the May-June issue of the magazine, special issue on private equity. Her two articles were The Smash and Grab Economy. Private equity billionaires are looting the country, leaving everyday Americans to clean up the mess and fight for scraps, which was the introduction to the package, and a piece on real estate called Real Estate Predators Tried to Cash In on the Pandemic, Then Tenants Fought Back, with a deck saying, I feel sometimes that we're up against this faceless money monster. Hannah, welcome to the New York Financial Writers Association meeting.
Thank you for having me.
I want to give special thanks to Catherine Hares, who is a longtime member of this organization, who came to us with a suggestion that we feature Hannah's work in one of our Zoom sessions, part of the series called Behind the Story, originated by board member Olivia Carville. Catherine was originally going to moderate it, but was not able to do so, so she turned it over to me. And it was a great idea. Once I actually read the stories, I was even more persuaded that this was a good choice. So once again, Hannah, thank you. Before we dig into the substance of your reporting, I'd just like to set the stage a little bit. Tell us a little bit of who you are, how you got into journalism, how you came to Mother Jones, and then how you got into this particular package on private equity.
Sure, yeah. Life story. My name is Hannah Levintova. I'm a reporter at Mother Jones. I now cover a lot of business stories. I try to do sort of big corporate accountability type of stories and sort of in-depth reporting. I was not always a business reporter. When I sort of started out as a reporter at Mother Jones, I was covering a lot more politics. I was based in Washington, D.C., and I found myself being really interested in money stories and also very unsure about how to cover them because I didn't have a business background. Like, it wasn't something I ever studied. It wasn't something I ever covered. So I started sort of reporting on the edges here and there, doing some tax policy stories and things like that. And then I ended up actually doing the Knight Bagehot Fellowship at Columbia. For those who don't know what it is, it's a partnership sort of between Columbia J School and the Columbia Business School, where they take reporters who cover business or cover finance and just drop them in the business school. And then you really get the full education, the most in-depth you could possibly imagine. And then I stayed on, I went back to my job and I got an MBA. I finished out the MBA at Columbia. So that was really the origin of me making a pivot to doing business reporting, which I've now been doing for probably, I guess, 3 or 4 years now, sort of more full-time. After covering politics for a while. So yeah, that's the Spark Notes.
Great. And tell us about how this project originated.
So I think for maybe a lot of other business journalists feel this way, but like being exposed to business school and being exposed to the business world sort of blew my mind open in so many ways, because there were so many industries that I realized that I just really didn't understand. And it was one of those situations where you realize how much you don't know because you're surrounded by so many experts in, investment banking, consulting, all of these things. And private equity was one of those worlds that sort of kept coming up when I was in business school, in my classes, among my classmates. It just kind of kept coming up and it really piqued my interest. So that was sort of the first kernel. And then actually the tenant story, the real estate story that you mentioned that I wrote for this package was actually the beginning, because a coworker of mine sort of very offhand was like, hey, there's something going on at my friend's apartment building in Brooklyn. I think it has something to do with private equity. Like, do you want to talk to him? And I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and I said, yeah, sure, I'll talk to him. I'm curious. It's not far for me to go and just see what's going on. And then once I started reporting that story, I realized, oh my gosh, this is an example of private equity. What private equity is doing in a lot of corners of the country when it comes to real estate was this particular story, which is, centered in Brooklyn. But that is parallels of this experience are happening in so many industries, sort of led by private equity firms and private equity investment. And so that originated the idea for, well, let's do a whole package. Let's do a whole themed issue about the impact of private equity's sort of incursions into all these corners of our daily lives, not just housing, but healthcare, fitness, fast food, retail, elder care, hospice care, veterinarians, dental care, like the list goes on and on and on. So, and one of the pieces of the package is actually this sort of a map where it's sort of like you're walking through a city and you see every little thing that you might just encounter as a regular person during your day, with an explanation of, oh, okay, well, here's how private equity has impacted that industry. So, yeah.
Great. No, I like how the whole thing started with a random call from a friend about somebody's apartment in Brooklyn.
Right.
And this great big package came from that. I think
Yes.
something a lot of journalists could learn from, which is to be open to reporting and little tidbits that, you may add up to nothing, but may add up to something. You might as well, listen to the those faint sounds.
Right. It's hard because there lots of tips don't sound like anything at the beginning. Um, and it feels like a risk to invest your time,
Right.
and to, get your sources' hopes up by talking to
Sure.
them more and more while you suss
Right.
out, well, can I actually write this story?
Right. Yes. Just a reminder to our audience that we're going to take questions, which written questions, and don't use the Q&A function. Use the chat function, please. And I'll sort through the questions and ask some of them. And don't wait till the end to ask. You can start asking right away. So I'll interject questions from you along with my own, because we really want this to be an interactive session. We're here for you, the audience, because we want this to be a learning experience for everybody. So Hannah, maybe we should just briefly go into the substance of the two pieces. Tell us just a little bit about the magnitude of private equity, some of the data you dug up on that. How big a deal is it?
Sure, yeah. So, the other piece that you mentioned is sort of an opening essay that framed this whole package to get into exactly what you just asked about, the depth of private equity's investment and also the impact of that. What the depth is one and the impact is two. And the depth, it's really quite extensive. Just a few of the numbers that we pulled in the course of pulling all of this together was that in 2020, private equity firms managed about $7.3 trillion in assets, which is roughly the value of Amazon, Apple, Tesla, and Microsoft combined. That number, 7.3 trillion, is actually more than the GDP of all but the two richest countries, which are the US and China. So every other country has a GDP that is less than 7.3 trillion. Um, you know, we found that, and this is data that is, pulled by, some of it is pulled from, like private equity trade associations, that the sector in 2020 generated about 6.5% of the US GDP, which is an increase from 2019 when it was about 5% of GDP. So an enormous, enormous chunk of our economy, like 6.5%. And I'm trying to remember, oh yeah, that, 1 in 14 workers is employed by a company in the US. 1 in 14 companies workers in the US are employed by a company controlled by private equity. So that's like about 12 million people.
Yeah.
So it's quite extensive.
Right. Now, the the tone that I get from reading the package is that, in a way, what private equity is sort of like heightened capitalism. It's companies that that were acquired may have been sort of bumbling along, making whatever they do, for 100 different reasons. Maybe there was a family-owned business. They wanted to keep their employees. Maybe it was a company that loved making products. They were very proud of whatever they made, products and services. But when private equity took over, it became boiled down to the kind of purest form of capitalism, which is maximizing profit. And so you think, well, that's capitalism. What's the problem here? And tell me about what the consequences are of private equity taking over.
Yeah. So I think that it's, if you think about I think private equity is sort of part of a shift that has happened since the 70s and 80s in the sort of governing philosophy behind what counts as success in business. Whereas before it was, creating new value, like a company making something innovative or making a really top rate product or something like that. It's now the focus is much more, like you said, it's about extracting, instead of creating new value, it's about extracting existing value through these different forms of financial engineering and these sorts of deals, like what private equity is doing, with leveraged buyouts and things like that. Um, so yes, I see what you're saying about the sort of capitalism in its purest form, but I also think that private equities rise was facilitated it's not just fueling capitalism. It was facilitated by a whole slew of history that I detail in the piece, including sort of a move within American business to become more anti-labor, various like 2000, the dot-com bust in 2001, the financial crisis in 2008. There are so many sort of historical things that also set the stage for this level of private equity investment in our daily lives.
What I
But
was thinking about, Hannah, is,
oh,
the examples you have in your intro, and then you expand on them in the real estate piece
of
of
the
things
impact.
that a company, private equity owned company, would do to maximize profits are not illegal, but they sort of push up against the edges of what you would consider to be ethical or legal. Loading up students with debt at for-profit colleges, raising rents on houses,
Mm-hmm.
increasing Medicaid billings at nursing homes, right? These things are all within the law, but it's just kind of like what you would do if your whole ambition was to maximize profit, right?
Okay, yeah, yes. I think to understand these impacts, you have to understand the kind of how private equity actually works. And this is a group of, financial journalists. So I don't want to belabor it, but I'm just going to, sort of just
Please, yes.
explain that quickly because
Yeah.
yes, it is a very much a maximizing profit philosophy. And that's because of how private equity funds are structured. So if I were to sort of explain this in the simplest terms, right? Private equity firms pool money from big investors, so like pension funds, university endowments, just wealthy individuals. And then they go and use that to buy companies or assets like real estate. They are charging those investors really high fees in exchange for this. They make you this promise that they're going to deliver big gains for their wealthy investors, right? Gains that are better than what you would get as just a regular person, investing in the stock market, right? That's what they're saying when they charge these high fees. They're going to get you better gains. So then the issue becomes, well, how do they get those better gains? Well, if they're buying an asset like real estate, it means, as happened in the Brooklyn story, kicking out tenants to flip that building to luxury condos as quickly as possible so that they can charge double or triple the rent, right? If they're buying a company, it entails restructuring to, like you said, maximize profit on an accelerated timeline, right? As quickly as possible. So laying up people off, cutting benefits, lowering wages, busting unions, selling off plants, like cutting costs down to something as minor as, one example I had in the essay was, a change as minor as cheaper paper towels at a hospital, but nurses that have to wipe their hands every day on those, that really, changes their experience.
Yeah.
So they have to, the point here is that they have to, because of how they're structured, they're doing this to maximize profit, to make money for their clients, to try to deliver on this promise of bigger gains, but also for themselves because of how deals are structured. Don't forget that they take a usually 20% cut of those gains. And on top of that, as private equity firms, they get to pay a lower tax rate on those gains than you and I would pay on our income. So there's just piece after piece after piece of how the industry is structured that incentivizes maximizing profit at the expense of a customer experience, in big and small ways. One example that I found really striking was, a group of business school professors did a study where they looked at nursing homes and they compared private equity owned nursing homes with ones that are not owned by private equity. And they actually found that at private equity owned nursing homes, Medicaid billing went up, so they were billing more, but mortality also went up. So that's a very kind of extreme example of the human consequences of this profit maximizing philosophy that private equity brings to their deals because of how the whole industry is structured.
Yes. Message to the audience. It turns out that for some reason the chat function isn't working. So contrary to what I said earlier, you should use Q&A because that's all you really can use. And Britt, who is online, will relay the questions to me. Of course, if you can use chat, go ahead, but try chat. Oh, now Britt's saying she may have fixed it. So try using chat first. If you fail, then use Q&A. Okay, so Hannah, there are some questions coming in, but there's one thing I just want to just really clarify for the audience before we go any farther, which is you haven't stressed this yet, but the key to private equity is they used to be called leveraged buyouts because usually a lot of leverage is involved. Most of the money for these takeovers is borrowed money. The same way you put a small down payment on a house, and then if the price of the house goes up, you make a killing because all you have to do is pay off the loan and then keep the rest. Exactly the same thing with private equity. So they are highly incentivized. Once they borrow that money, they have to be able to pay all that interest. So otherwise they're going to lose the company. So that adds to this drive to cut costs wherever possible, right?
Yes, to a point, although one of the most controversial elements of leveraged buyouts is that the debt that so a private equity firm buys a company. In the opening essay I wrote, I used the first sort of leveraged buyout, the first big leveraged buyout ever as an example. They buy this company and they load up the company with debt, but the private equity firm isn't responsible for paying off that debt. Only the acquired company is. So yes, to a point, they, of course, that is driving the profit maximizing philosophy, but, a number of the sort of legislative reforms that have been proposed at the federal level, one of the big ones is to actually make private equity firms responsible for some of the debt that they load onto their acquisition targets. So that for this exact reason.
I didn't know about that. That's very interesting. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's go to some questions. One is from Greg Miles. He writes, how rigorous is government regulation of private equity companies, and what needs to be done in the regulatory area? Do private equity companies operate with almost free rein from regulation outside the US? So that's sort of inside and outside. What are your thoughts?
I am definitely less familiar with internationally, but in the US, regulation of private equity is actually it's much less stringent than it would be of like the traditional banking industry. And that is actually in part because of, so after, 2008, 2009, the foreclosure crisis and the recession, obviously Congress passed Dodd-Frank. And at the time, the sort of the institutional players, the financial institutions that the country was most angry with were the banks, right? The banks that got bailed out, the banks that bought the subprime mortgage, the subprime gave out subprime mortgages and all of these things. So it was the banks that were really the subject of most of the regulation in that bill. And very little attention was paid relatively to private equity. So private equity funds do have to file, private equity funds that are bigger than that have more than $150 million in assets under management do have to file disclosures with the SEC, but those disclosures are confidential. So the SEC gets them, presumably for regulatory purposes, but as the public, we can't see them, unlike, disclosures that banks have to file.
Sure.
So the regulation is definitely less robust than it is with big banks and sort of more traditional financial actors. There was another piece of the question that I'm forgetting. Regulation. I think I got it.
I think you got the basic
Yeah.
idea. So another question here from Paula Seligson. Thank you for doing this talk. How did you decide what to highlight in your story and how to structure it, especially in the context of taking something so financy and making it accessible to engaging to a broader audience?
I love this question so much because this is something I think about all the time. I think so part of this is I mentioned at the beginning that I did the Knight Bagehot Fellowship and then I got an MBA through that. And being a journalist in business school who had never worked in a big corporate, I'd never worked in a lot of these sorts of places. I felt like it was a different language. And so I think part of this is that I had to learn to explain this stuff to myself in regular words, in layman's terms. You take accounting and they're like debits and credits and this and that, and you're like, wait, which one's minus, which one's plus? Like just really simple exercises like that. And so in the context of thinking how to do this in the story, I was particularly in the opening essay where it was like, I'm going to talk about private equity. I'm going to talk about this wonky industry. How do I make this readable? I was like, there has to be a central character and that can sort of drive this. And luckily, I was talking to Eileen Applebaum, who is sort of one of the preeminent scholars on private equity. And I had ordered her book, but I hadn't finished reading it yet. And she was like, oh, yeah, there's a part of my book about this company, Hudai, that was the first sort of big leveraged buyout. There had been a few before, but it was the first big one. And I was like, oh, wait a second. I need to go page over to the part of the book I haven't read yet. And when I saw that and I started looking at it, I realized, okay, this company can be my narrative vehicle to make this real so that I'm not just using big financial words on paper that are super just dry to read. And it was, because it was such an important part of history, there were just great like old New York Times articles that I could pull from and quote from and in sort of constructing that old story. So that having a narrative vehicle was key, and just like stripping out financial jargon. I think so many of the words that the business world uses are unnecessarily kind of not inclusive. and they make that world feel very scary and inaccessible to people that don't have an MBA or haven't worked in corporate America or haven't been in an investment bank. And just having been the person in business school who was like, what is happening? Like, what is this
Mhm.
sentence that you just said?
Yeah,
I'm very attuned to that. Just always like, we don't need to say big, if we can find a normal, regular person word, let's use that.
right. I can relate to that. I work for the New York Times opinion section, and I have a newsletter. And yesterday, my newsletter was about the getting into the topic of capital. It was about the
Mm,
Nobel Prize winners, but bank capital. I was determined not to use the word capital. So
mm,
I found a way to describe it, talking about selling shares versus taking deposits and borrowing from other banks and so on. And I think actually by not using the word capital, I had to get down to the fundamentals of the idea, which are what really matter anyway, and made it kind of more real than it would have been if it was just going straight to the boilerplate phrase. So yeah,
right.
agree with that.
Yeah,
Now,
that's so
go ahead.
real. Oh no,
So
I was just gonna, sorry.
um, so there are some questions about your real estate piece, but before we get into the detailed questions, I just want you to ask you to give us the high level narrative of what happened there, bringing it from the start when you first heard about this on up to the present.
Okay, I will try. Yes. So just what happened? All right.
Yeah.
So, um, the SparkNotes version is that this building in the spring of 2021, residents there started getting notices saying that your building has been sold. And soon they learned that the new owner, whoever was some LLC that they didn't know who was behind the LLC, was not going to be renewing their leases. Now, this building it's really below market rent. It's a great location, 70 Prospect Park West. It's literally across from Prospect Park. But it's really below market because it's one of these New York buildings where it's like it's totally fine, it's decent, but it's also not super fancy. But as a result, people get to live there for a more reasonable price. So of course, all these residents, many of whom had lived there for decades, were freaking out. What are we going to do? And one of them, who is one of the key players in the piece on two, she is a lawyer and a labor organizer by trade. And so she sort of started going deep to figure out what is going on here. Um, so her and her housemates organized their building, and started, going deep, doing all this research, making spreadsheets, going through the New York property records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They figured out that this company, a real estate development company called Greenbrook, had bought their building. And it soon became clear that they had done this in partnership with a private equity firm called NW1, and that NW1 had put up the capital for this strategy. And soon they figured out that their building was far from the only one. What they saw was, so this is right, 2021, a year into the pandemic. And they saw that by the time that their building got bought, Greenbrook, in partnership with NW1, had purchased at least 52 apartment buildings in Brooklyn, primarily in Park Slope and Bushwick. But at the time that my story published, it was it was like 111 and potentially even more, because um, some of the filings make it quite opaque to figure out if it's actually a Greenbrook building or not, which gets back to the question about regulation that someone asked earlier,
Yeah.
that these sort of opaque ownership structures kind of can conceal private equity's impact. So anyway, they figured out that uh, you know, dozens and dozens of buildings were being bought up, and that the strategy here was very much a strategy of, we are going to buy up pandemic distressed real estate in, in New York City, where real estate values went down during COVID when so many people fled the city. That was the strategy. The strategy was, we're going to buy up pandemic distressed real estate and we're going to kick those tenants to the curb in the middle of a public health emergency so that we can flip their homes to luxury condos, luxury rentals, excuse me, and just make a ton more money on our investment. And the twist here was that, right, private equity is investing money on behalf of investors, right? Pension funds or someone like that. So it turned out that in this case, a lot of the money for the strategy that was invested by a sovereign wealth fund in Texas, a $50 million fund that funds the entire public education system in Texas, the public schools, the universities, etc. So it was this pitting the interests, like the education needs of Texans, against the housing needs of people in pandemic distressed Brooklyn. So those are sort of the basics. The tenants started organizing, canvassing. I went with them and watched as they canvassed buildings in Bushwick and Park Slope and letting people know, like, hey, if your building was just bought by Greenbrook, you don't need to leave, you can fight back. It was kind of amazing, watching them canvass. They would show up at new buildings that they'd never canvassed, and someone would open the door and be like, oh, I've heard of you guys. Like, I know what you're doing. They really organized a lot of effort. They had rallies. Chuck Schumer came to one of their rallies because he lives down the road. He lives on Prospect Park West. So they organized quite a bit. They filed a lawsuit, and the lawsuit they are still there. So, well, I should say a few of the tenants on the lawsuit are still there, but many of them have left because they just couldn't deal with the uncertainty of, am I going to get kicked out of my home or have to pay, triple the rent?
Right. Yeah. So one of the people who was asking about this is Catherine Hares, the person who inspired this meeting. So I guess the answer to the question that she asked is that Greenbrook Partners still does own the building.
They do still own the building, and the lawsuit is still, so the residents are still there. The lawsuit is still pending. So they're allowed to stay in the building while the lawsuit continues.
I'm sure you're going to be watching that.
Yeah. It's interesting because, the lawsuit is actually about, it alleges that the building used to be rent stabilized and was illegally destabilized by an earlier landlord, not these owners. But if that is found to be true, then the new owner, Greenbrook, will have to pay all this back rent that was the toehold that they had to file this lawsuit. So it remains to be seen whether Greenbrook and they're sort of the private equity partner in this acquisition will sort of, be stuck with a very large bill, depending on how the lawsuit goes.
By the way, that Texas fund is 50 billion, right? Not 50 million.
Billion. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I misspoke. Yes.
Yeah. So Catherine has another question, which I think is a good one. I should have asked it myself. Have any members or elements of the private equity industry responded to your reporting? And if so, what has been their response?
Another great question. Yes, they have responded. I've gotten a series of different responses. I heard from a few sort of like, people working at private equity funds, where the gist of the response was essentially, well, you're focusing on what private equity is doing, and you're focusing on but it's unfair that you're focusing on private equity because so many other players in finance do this as well. And I was surprised by that response because they weren't saying, well, what you wrote isn't true. They're saying, but everybody else does it too. So why is this newsworthy? Like, why are you writing about this? Why is it a big deal?
Yeah.
And I thought, like, I don't see that response as like absolution, right? Just because other people are doing it, other industries, not just private equity, but other corners of the finance world are also doing it, that doesn't make it better, right? It just, if anything, it proves the point of how broad this sort of extractive investment philosophy is. Right? Like they didn't say, well, no, this is wrong. You got it wrong, which is what, always what I'm afraid of, because I mean, we all are, right? That's what journalists, our worst fear is that someone's like, everything you wrote is completely incorrect.
Right. Yeah.
It was that it's not news. It's just
Yeah.
what happens.
Right.
Which was, it just sort of, yeah, that was really fascinating to me. But I've heard, some positive responses as well, getting at, thank you for sort of laying this out in ways that a general audience can digest. Because I think a lot of what really surprised me is that I was worried private equity is so wonky and dry. No one's going to want to read this. No one who's not already a finance nerd is going to want to read this. But it turned out that so many people have sort of heard the term and didn't totally understand what it meant. That there was a total hunger for an explanation of it in a story form, in a readable, digestible way that targets a general audience as opposed to a super finance literate, Wall Street literate audience.
Yeah.
And so that was a very clear response as well. Like, thank you for laying this out in a way that more people can understand.
Oh, good. Good. Glad to hear it. You also, in fairness, mentioned that not all private equity is destructive. You talk about how there's sometimes private equity will come in and improve the management of a company and make it work better. Talk about that side a little bit.
Yeah. So I heard when I talked to a number of academics about in the course of reporting, and the theory that I sort of heard here is that um when private equity comes into an industry that doesn't have a lot of contact with like federal funding or government funding, there's a lot more room for it to actually be helpful and to make a business more efficient. But obviously, healthcare is not that, right? You have Medicare, you have Medicaid, like so much government regulation, so much government funding, right? Healthcare is not a space like that. Elder care is not a space like that. Education is not a space, there's yes, there are examples where they bring in business expertise and they can actually make a business more efficient by cutting fat in a productive way. But like business school professors have studied this and found that that is very much how private equity is sold as no, we're just coming in to make your business more efficient. But that is very much the exception and not the rule. There's a study that actually looked at this and found that in the majority of cases, it does not end up actually long-term making the business more productive.
Now, also private equity targets certain industries much more than others. For example, there's not nearly as much private equity in something like biotech or infotech, partly because those are growth industries that rely on, key players, and laying off those players destroys the value of the firm. And they require a lot of investment, rather than being something you can extract money from. It's something that you have to pump money into in the hope that it'll pay off with future gains. That's not the game that the PE people want to play.
So this is interesting because that is the game that venture capital plays, right? And
Right.
venture capital it's kind of a type of private equity that instead of investing in established companies, they put money into startups, where they're willing to lose money in hopes that one of their big investments is going to be, the next Facebook, the next Google, whatever it is.
Right.
So I would say that even in those sorts of the industries where you have to pump a lot of money into them, that's really that are tech adjacent. That's sort of where you're seeing the private equity cousin of venture capital.
It's a cousin, but it's sort of a distant cousin. They have kind of different business models. Just the fact that in both cases it's private money coming in. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to just remind the audience that we are open for business. Hannah is ready to take your questions. So far, it's been a fascinating session. And Hannah, did sometimes in the course of doing one article, you get ideas for others. Can you tell us what you've done since then, or what you're working on? Or I don't want you to give away any secrets, but whatever you feel comfortable talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I heard from actually a couple of other groups of tenants around the country where something very similar is happening. And I'm sort of weighing whether that's a story that I should write or pass on to other people, because it almost feels like repetition of the Brooklyn story.
Yeah.
With, obviously different people, different locations, different motivations and things like
Yeah.
that. I am working on a follow-up story that I won't talk too much about, just to, not give anything away.
That's fine.
Yeah, but I think it has just sharpened my eye towards other ways in which profit maximizing actors and philosophies influence every corner of our daily lives, right?
Yeah.
I think that's just the sort of the theme of the reporting that I'm doing, and that I hope a lot of journalists in my newsroom and elsewhere will continue to do, because there's infinite stories to be told.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just even on the special issue you guys did, I think there were 8 stories in the package altogether, including yours. Can you, something like that?
I think it was like 14 and some of them were very small, like some
Oh,
of
I
them.
see.
But
Okay.
yes.
So
Eight
that's a
big ones.
lot, and it was a bunch of different staffers doing it. I presume that at this stage, you're probably more knowledgeable than maybe anybody else on the Mother Jones staff, right, on this topic. And so were you instrumental in shaping what the components would be, and looking over stories, providing editing help and so on? Can you talk about that part?
Yeah. So I was, but along with my editor, Ian Gordon, I sort of went to him initially with this idea for a package, and then we became partners in crime and sort of did a lot of that together.
Yeah.
I sort of found myself, I mean, obviously there were spreadsheets with who's doing what, and I found myself sort of parachuting into like Slack chats with a bunch of pairings of reporters and editors and saying, okay, hey, you're doing, for example, you're doing a story on, the carried interest loophole. Like, how can I help you with the sort of reporting strategy for this corner of it? Or our food and ag reporter did one about this ethanol pipeline, and him and I going back and forth about, okay, you need a source to sort of talk to you about the private equity influence and give you some of that history, like where can you find some of those sources? So the idea was, we have all these people that cover all of these different beats, but there's a private equity angle in all of those beats, in food and ag, in housing, in healthcare, whatever it is. And how can we parachute in and help you, even if you're not a business reporter, right? How can we help you find that sourcing that you need to expand the particular corner relevant to your story and your beat? But yeah, we had stories, we had the one I mentioned, it was about a private equity firm that was trying to capitalize on like federal climate tax credits to build a pipeline that a lot of environmentalists are very opposed to. We had a story about private equity firms buying up anorexia treatment centers. We had a bunch of as told tos from employees at companies that were bought up by private equity. So, including, I saw a question about journalism, a local newspaper in Pennsylvania. I'm trying to think, we had, a story about the carried interest tax loophole, which is this loophole that allows private equity firms to pay fewer taxes on the enormous gains that they get from their deals, because they don't have to classify those gains as income. They get to pay capital gains tax on it, which, I mean, saves them millions and millions and millions of dollars in taxes and makes the industry even more lucrative. So much. So yeah, we got into regulation, we got into all these different industries as examples that we sort of, shined a light into, or a magnifying glass on. I could go on and on.
Yeah, no, did you find it satisfying to play that role?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think as journalists, as reporters, we always have a million stories that we don't have time to do because one person can only do so much. And it's rare that you get to, say, well, I'm curious about this, but you go do it,
Right.
That's great.
Yeah.
It was really cool. It was really, really wonderful. And to have the institutional support to deploy so many of our newsrooms resources. We made a video, our video team did, it was sort of like an ad you would see for kind of like an all-American small town, but it has this sort of a dystopian angle, but to illustrate sort of the private equity investment. It was amazing to be able to deploy that many resources and reporters and editors.
Nice.
I feel like the scope had to mirror the scope of the package, had to mirror the scope of the whole point, which is like, look at this one industry's enormous investment in American life.
Yeah. All right, we do have a few more questions. I want to get to them, and don't feel like you need to go on it at length, because we got to get through a few here. So here's the first. PE is continuing. This is from Paula again. PE is continuing to grow. Many firms are still doing large new fundraisings even this year. Do you have any sense of what the next big extractive strategy might be as PE firms continue to search for ways to invest this money?
Healthcare. Okay. Healthcare continues to grow. Private equity investments in healthcare continue to grow, as well as sort of elder care, nursing homes and hospice, because for demographic reasons, right? We have an aging population. The baby boomer generation is aging, and we're not having enough kids. Millennials aren't having enough kids. There's sort of obvious demographic reasons why investing in those spaces is going to prove profitable.
So healthcare. Another question, this one from Catherine. In conducting research for this story in PE, what was your take on PE journalism in general? And then a sub question is there a lot of focus on the outcome of PE deals, or what did you see?
Oh, PE, not private equity buying up journalism, but just journalism.
I think what she means is the journalists who write about PE.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that a lot, because of how journalism is structured, we have a lot of amazing publications like the Wall Street Journal or the FT that have huge teams of reporters that are very good at reporting on private equity, but they're writing it for primarily a finance literate audience, also general audience, but they have an industry audience as well. And so of course, there is a focus on the outcomes, good and bad, of PE deals, because that's what, as journalists, we're all trying to do, is, find the stories about powerful players that should be doing better. But I also think there's a lot of room for more of that accountability reporting about private equity. And it's really hard to do because it's complicated. A lot of journalists don't have a business background. It takes a lot of time, and we all don't have enough time. We have to pump out stories. So there is a focus on the outcome of private equity deals, but also there could be even more.
Okay, good. Greg has a question. What can be done to stop or curb this pattern of abusive extraction by private equity? It was striking when you said that private equity is much less regulated than banking. And why are private equity company reports filed with the regulators not available to the public?
Great question. Honestly, I wish I had a conclusive answer to why. I think part of why private equity continues to be regulated less is because lawmakers are not incentivized to crack down on them and to pass stringent regulation, because private equity funds are campaign donors. They have a ton of capital. They're quite wealthy. And it would essentially be biting the hand that feeds you. Of course, there are exceptions to that. But overall, I think that's why for many decades, private equity has withstood extensive regulation, because there's little incentive to regulate them. There's little lawmaker incentive to regulate them more.
I mean, one reaction to that is looking at sector by sector. Obviously, there are regulations on the things they do. For example, there could be rent control, there could be a crackdown on Medicaid billing, and so on.
Totally.
As for the SEC, the argument of PE would be, well, this is a private company. It's just like a mom and pop grocery store. Mom and pop grocery store doesn't have to open its books to the general public. It's only companies that sell shares that need to do that. So that would be the logic. That'd be the argument.
Right. Or it's like, well, all these public entities, like a pension fund, right, or a sovereign wealth fund, by virtue of them being investors in private equity, well, there are lots of public filings that you can go look up about a pension fund, about a public university endowment, things like that. So that's sort of the back door in terms of getting information on the industry, even though the reports themselves with the SEC aren't public.
Right. Okay. Folks, I want you to get your questions in soon. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up pretty soon. So I'm going to vamp a little bit here and maybe Hannah will ask a question or so, but otherwise, Hannah, just to talk to you about this, you chose to get the Knight Badgett Fellowship. I mean, obviously you had to apply for it, but you got accepted, you won the fellowship, and you continued on for the MBA, which is not a requirement, right? That took extra time.
Mm-hmm.
And there are probably people on this call who have thought about doing that. Are you glad, A, that you did the Knight Badgett, and B, that you continued on to get the MBA?
Oh, yes, 100%. Yes. If anyone on this call wants to apply, has questions, email me, DM me on Twitter. I'm happy to talk about it. I've talked to so many people who've thought about applying or who've gone ahead and done it. Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, the Badgett by itself, that 1 year, is just incredible, because you get dropped into business school, and there's how rare is it that you get to interact really directly with a lot of the industries that you seek to report on. Obviously, if I could go like, work at one of these places, that would be even more in depth, but you're about as close as you can get by virtue of your classmates and professors and just the nature of the classes. So yes, and the MBA was just an extra year to dig in and take more, the first year you take a lot of the core classes that are just the foundational classes,
Right.
and having that extra time to dig into particular industries that I thought would be interesting to me, and to take classes that would be helpful in my reporting was incredible. I don't think it makes you a perfect expert, but it transformed my ability to know what questions to ask and who to go to ask those questions.
Yeah, no, good.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think I'm going to wrap it at this stage, unless you have any final words of wisdom. No. So many thanks to Hannah Levintova of Mother Jones Magazine for participating in this behind the story Zoom call.